So excited to talk to you about the new Dangerous Black Market series for Trafficked Underworlds. I find it like super intriguing and really scary, a lot of the situations that you're put through. And you've built your career on so many like monumentous things such as like sex trafficking and rape and the medical industry. I guess how do you kind of put trust in being put into these experiences, like being driven to like a private lab and places such as the dark place of the heaven of cannabis, I believe they called it. Um, Being put in these situations and being driven to these locations, I guess, kind of, and places that aren't receptive of journalists. How do you kind of go about that?
Yeah, I've been covering black markets for over 20 years. I've always been fascinated by these markets. I think most people don't know that actually almost half of the world's economy are these black and gray markets, and yet we know very little about them. And so part of what I do is trying to get access to these worlds and these deep, dark, secret corners of the world that we don't usually see. And it takes a long time. It takes months, sometimes even years, to get people to convince people to talk to us. But I'd say that once we actually are given that permission. And I also say that for every yes we get dozens, sometimes even hundreds of no's. So I've gotten very used to being turned down and just keep going forward and trying to more opportunities and more doors, knocking on more doors. But eventually, once we are given that permission, there's a sense of safety there. But you never know. I mean, we have situations where we were filming an episode for this season, for example, in Niger. We're in the Sahel region of Africa, and it's an incredibly dangerous part of the world. You've got terrorist attacks constantly, you've got kidnappings, robberies, and we were there with a military escort in that situation because the government wouldn't allow us to go there without it. And we were in a small desert town, so no protection around us. And suddenly there was a military coup, completely unexpectedly, and the military protection was taken away from us at the same time as the borders were closed and the airspace was closed. So we had no way to leave the country. So sometimes you prepare yourself for all the dangers that you think exist, but many times that danger actually comes from completely unexpected avenues, such as military coups.
And I know something that you've definitely have a lot of experience is gaining trust from sources. How do you kind of handle like conflicting information from sources and going about knowing like what's good news judgment and who you can trust?
Mm-hmm. It's not easy because it's very difficult to corroborate some of what people tell me. Obviously, these are people who are paid to not talk many times, and sometimes risk their lives and to be able to talk to us and tell us what is happening. So it is very hard to corroborate, but we make it part of the show, and I'm very transparent. Remember interviewing, for example, an organ trafficker in Colombia and talking to him about, he was telling me how he hacked up people's bodies and took these organs. And I was constantly trying to figure out, I'd spoken to doctors before to figure out what was possible in terms of the extraction and transportation of organs. And I was asking him all these questions. And at the end, once he left, I turned to the camera and I explained how it was very hard to listen to some of that, but also how it was hard to corroborate whether he was saying the truth or not. But at the end of the day, because it is dangerous and because these are secrets that people usually don't like to share, we don't really see what benefit they would have from telling us lies. And oftentimes we speak to more than one person. Obviously, we speak to many, and through all the people and sort of all the research and investigative resources that we have to figure out if it is or not the truth that they're telling us.
And one thing that you do very well and that your show kind of explores is like the ethical side of things, and you kind of look into people's motivations without any judgment, and you kind of go based off things like economy. And like I even saw like in one of the episodes they mentioned that people rely on planting marijuana to avoid famine and poverty. So I
Yeah.
guess how do you kind of go about like exploring like difficult ethical like decisions in your reporting and how you approach it?
I think for me, the motivation for why people get involved in a life of crime is always more fascinating than anything else, because I do think that without the vast majority of times, it is a lack of opportunity that leads people to a life of crime. Nobody is born wanting to be a criminal. It's not something that you decide, oh, sounds really fun to start killing people or trafficking body parts. And it's not always the case. Of course, there are people who make it a choice, and that's the choice, the life they want to lead. But the vast majority of times, it is a lack of opportunities and the inequality that exists in this world that leads to the existence of these black markets. So for me, I think that motivation is always sort of the most interesting question of all. And again, looking at these problems and the existence of these black markets through the lens of what caused them, what are the root causes for them, and understanding, again, if we understand the root cause, we'll be able to prevent these black markets from existing.
And in one of the new episodes, a fellow journalist helped you gain access to an emerging black market for a new deadly product for counterfeit pharmaceuticals. So this was kind of scary, like how you explore how it ties to the American healthcare system, the demand for cheaper drugs. You mentioned in India there were 2,500 pills made like in one night, and how they're not like real ingredients and all these dangerous chemicals. I guess how do you kind of build a network and a relationship with people, say, such as experts that can identify counterfeit products, and are they ever scared to work with you?
Yeah, that was a particularly difficult episode, actually. You have 20 million Americans that are using, have to resort to the black market in order to be able to afford their medication. The United States has some of the highest prices for medicine in the world. And again, 20 million Americans that cannot afford their medication is crazy. So they have to go to places like Mexico, where you can find much cheaper meds, or go online and find these online pharmaceutical companies that sometimes, many times actually, we found through our reporting, are selling people with fake drugs. So we flew all the way to India and spent time in a lab filming these guys making these pills that they were selling as if it was amoxicillin, which is an antibiotic that cures typical infections that many of us have. But it was nothing. There was just calcium and food coloring in these pills. So people are in America buying these pills and these medications, thinking that they're going to help cure their diseases or make them feel better. And in fact, there's nothing in them. And sometimes there's actual poison and toxic ingredients in these medications that have led to deaths around the world and here in America as well. And that is incredibly scary. But again, I think I always like to look at what is the motivation, not only in this case for the people that are making these drugs, but what is the motivation for Americans and why are they having to resort to a black market? And so at the end of that episode, we go to Washington, D.C. and ask people in the pharmaceutical industry, why is it that we have the most expensive medication in the world? We're the richest country in the world, and why aren't Americans able to afford, their life-saving medications?
Yeah, it was really scary. In the Mexican cartel lab that they showed, the pills are packaged in the thousands and they're made to look exactly the same. Like you mentioned, the cotton. That's so frightening.
Exactly the same. I mean, the little cotton that goes inside the pill bottle, the way the pill bottle is shut, that little seal at the top, the medication itself, it looks exactly like the real thing. And then actually there was an LA Times investigation that we included in our story that was incredible, where they found that in a lot of these pills, some of them had fentanyl and meth mixed with them. So again, and these were being sold at what looked like reputable pharmacies on the other side of the border in Mexico. So it's crazy that this is ending up in the hands of Americans.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Muk Media and like your thought-provoking material and kind of what you want to explore more of in the future?
Yeah. So the show Trafficked, which is now, we're filming the 5th season. The 4th season is about to come out. For me, it's the best season yet. It was very personal. Lots of incredible things happened through the filming of it. And I think we have 10 really strong films that explore very important subject matters these days. And it is made, Trafficked is made by Muk Media, which is my production company that I own with my husband and 3 other partners. And we hope that we can continue making thought-provoking journalism, investigative journalism for many years to come.
And you have a very amazing, impressive career. I read that you weren't prepared. Well, it was shocking, like when you just started out, like having to report on 9/11. how our producer called you in like 3 hours, you had to go live. I guess, can you tell us a little bit about the beginning of your career?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a journalist at Columbia University's grad school. I was a student, sorry. I was a student at Columbia University Grad School of Journalism. I just started, I'd worked for a travel show in Portugal and where I'm from, and had just moved to New York for that program. And a month into the program, 9/11 happened, and I got a call from the television station I'd worked for in Portugal, and they said, you have 10 minutes to get midtown and go to the high rise of this building where all these foreign journalists with way more experience than I had are all assembled and reporting live for their own countries. There's a satellite feed there. And I went, and again, I had never done hard-hitting reporting before, and I certainly had never done a live report before. And suddenly, in one of the most important news days of our lives, a day that changed so many people's lives, there I was, reporting live on the events of that day for Portugal. And I remember this feeling of sort of, um, relief after, feeling like, okay, I've always wanted to be a journalist and I think I can, it looks like I can do it. I was so nervous beforehand. And then it's like, oh my God, I did it. I did my live feed. I was able to talk. This is great. I felt this enormous sense of relief. And then walking down the stairs to the streets after, the streets of New York, and seeing the first signs of people looking for their loved ones with posters and photos. And this moment that really hit me, that obviously this was a much larger story. And it was one that changed my career as a journalist, because it was at the moment that I realized the kind of journalism and reporting that I wanted to do was where we understand the motivations and what leads people to, to commit these horrific crimes. So a year later, I moved to the Middle East and I started reporting on, what was happening in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria at the time.
Right in it. So for this season of Trafficked, can you tell us about like some of your favorite highlights? Because you mentioned this is your first time back home filming in your home country.
Yeah, it was the first time filming in my home country. I think this season is my favorite for many reasons, not only because it is very personal and also because I think it is the best, but all right off the bat, the first episode, we went to Portugal to do an episode on hash and the smuggling of hash. So hash is made out of the marijuana plant, but instead of being the flowers, the stuff that's used here in the United States, it's actually the resin gland. But it is the first drug, sort of the intro drug to the majority of Europeans, and including myself. The first drug I ever tried when I was a teenager was a joint that was made out of hash. And I got to go to Portugal, and I've always been curious about where does the hash come from, who makes it, who transports it, how does it make it to these capitals all over Europe. And so we got the opportunity to go to start in Portugal and then do the trip to Morocco, where hash is being produced, and to Spain, where it's being transported. And is a crazy ride because, again, it's incredibly dangerous. What the journey that we did, the people that we met, but also incredibly eye-opening. A really sort of unique look into a multi-billion-dollar industry.
And how do you go about, I guess, kind of finding some of your stories? You had a really interesting story come about from a woman sending you a DM about her father missing.
Yeah, again, it's why this season became so personal. One of the most fascinating episodes this season started because I received a direct message on Instagram from this woman from Minnesota who's just told me, look, I need your help. I've watched your show. I think you can help me. My father is in prison in Mozambique, in an African country. I know Mozambique also because they speak Portuguese. It's a former Portuguese colony. And so when she said this, I became immediately super curious. And it led us on a very long, many months investigation into what had happened to her dad, and figured out that he'd been the victim of a massive scam that is targeting a lot of older Americans. And he was in prison. He wasn't alone. He'd been there with one American and one Canadian, all three of them victims of the same scam. And at the end of it, we were actually able to confront one of their scammers, one of the men responsible for him being in prison. And this man is now the man in prison, the American in prison, his name is Rodney Baldas. He's now 70 years old. He's going to be there for another 16 years. And it's possible that he might die in prison. And it's very sad. And one of the things that we hope this film will do is that it will get the American government to take another look at this case, or a deeper look, because they haven't really looked at this case, and release Rodney and so many others that are in prison around the world, just like him.
And I guess what kind of advice would you offer to new students or new upcoming investigative journalists that might be a little frightened, I guess, of the scary side of it, like the harassment and other things that may experience, but kind of, I guess, guiding them on the path to figuring out how to like research and analyze information?
I would say, journalism, there's many types of journalism. Not everybody needs to be out there investigating black markets. It's the passion that I've always had. But I think the most important advice that I have for journalists is to find what is your passion. If you're truly passionate about journalism, what subject matters are you passionate about? And once you find those, is you go for it and you keep at it. It wasn't easy for me as when I was young, when I was, when I moved to the Middle East, because I was fascinated by what was happening in the Middle East. And after that, it wasn't, I kept on sending people story ideas that nobody wanted to do. I kept on knocking on doors and making phone calls to commissioning editors who were just not excited or didn't want to commission the stories that I was pitching. And you just persist, you keep at it. Even my story of going to Columbia University for journalism, I came from a small town in Portugal, and I applied to Columbia University for journalism because I knew I wanted to be a journalist. And I applied the first time and I didn't get in. I applied the second time, I didn't get in. The third time I flew to New York and I knocked on the dean's door. And I told them, look, I'm Mariana, I'm from Portugal, and I really want to be a journalist. And that year I was accepted. So again, do not take no for an answer. And eventually I think you'll get there.
That's really motivating to hear. Like if people kind of give up on their passions, to see like the amazing path that you've made for yourself.
Oh, thank you, Nadia. I really appreciate it.
But thank you so much for taking the time. This was amazing. Everyone make sure to check out this series. It's a lot of crazy intense moments, but it's amazing. Thank you so much, Mariana.
Thank you, Nadia.
Juan Carlos brought videos he claims to have captured on his phone that seemed to show just that. Due to patient privacy, Juan Carlos would not allow us to share the footage, though we can't independently confirm the authenticity of the videos. In one of them, the staff uniforms clearly say Jolie. What's happening here?
So he's not a doctor.
And then what happens if something, if one of the surgeries gets, complicated?
Things go wrong.
And considering the amount of deaths, why hasn't anyone come out and spoken, like you?
At the end of the day, it's about money.